Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Radio Free Mormon. That guy over there, I think that's Bill Reel. And welcome to another episode of Mormonism Live, episode number 187 to be exact. How are you doing tonight, Mr. Reel?
I'm doing great, Radio Free Mormon. And folks, one of the things we wanted to bring to your attention is RFM and I have been behind the scenes talking about a fun new idea. And I'll put it up on the screen here and we'll see what folks think. We're talking about doing a new show. We do the news program with Rebecca Biblioteca on Monday nights at 6 p.m. We do Mormonism Live at 6:20 p.m. On Wednesday evenings. And you and I are talking about a Mormonism After Dark. And we're still working out when that will be, although we hope it will be dark out a little.
It'll be sometime after dark.
Yeah. And we're thinking of something a little more, maybe risque would be the right word. A little more dark humor, a little more riffing, a little less preparation, and a little more, I think everyone's going to like this, a little more listener and viewer involvement.
Oh, yes, very much so. In fact, we're playing with the idea of having this largely, if not completely, viewer-driven as far as subject matter, as far as interactions with phone calls and live chat, and just having a good time, a fun time, and one where we can all sort of interact more than we can in any other podcast that we've done so far.
Yeah, so folks, be on the lookout. We're still in the planning stages of this, but we've begun some serious conversation. And so sometime maybe in the next few weeks to maybe a couple of months, you should see another show with Radio Free Mormon and myself. And we're going to get a little more adult oriented with Mormonism After Dark.
Yes, I may wear a DC Comics t-shirt.
Yeah. And I won't wear Marvel. You can wear DC. And I'm not sure if I'll wear anything for this show, to be honest.
Okay. All right. Save something for the first episode.
Okay. Sounds good, my friend. I'll take that off the screen. You can tell us what we're doing tonight.
Yeah, we've got a special guest tonight. It is Kolby Reddish. It is episode, I think I said 187 tonight of Mormonism Live. And the title is Jacob Hansen's Thinking Errors. Kolby Reddish, come out of the green room. There he is. Hi, Kolby. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Well, you are more than welcome. Always a pleasure to have you on the show. You are such a delightfully crisp and sharp thinker. And I really appreciate that about you. And you're going to be applying some of those skills tonight to one of our favorite people, Jacob Hansen, who has a podcast called Thoughtful Faith. Not A Thoughtful Faith, because that one was already taken by somebody down under. The Kiwi, right? The Gina Colvin.
Yeah.
That was hers, A Thoughtful Faith. And then he did his called Thoughtful Faith. And I think I heard him say at some point when that was brought to his attention that was inadvertent on his part. And I've got no reason to, disbelieve him on that. But recently, Jacob Hansen had a debate with another guy named Jacob, except this other guy named Jacob, his last name is Isbell, I think, Isbel. And the debate was on the subject of whether Joseph Smith really did practice polygamy or whether it was a massive conspiracy. Jacob Hansen taking the side that, yes, Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, and Jacob Isbell on the other side taking the side that, no, he didn't. This was a big conspiracy started up by Brigham Young and John Taylor, who I guess was the hitman to off Joseph Smith in Carthage.
Yeah, it's an ever expanding conspiracy theory. It's really ad hoc, the polygamy denier side of the debate, in my view. If I can just kind of set intentions, one of the reasons that I want to do a response like this to Jacob Hansen is that he's a bully, frankly. If you look at his YouTube channel, he's done a number of different attack videos about, I think, both of you, probably. Folks like Dan McClellan, Jim Bennett, Dr. Julie Hanks, repeatedly, a professor that I RA'd for at BYU, Professor Thomas Wayment, who I know you're familiar with his work, Bill, as you are as well, RFM. I guess just for those who maybe have never caught my Mormon Stories interview, just to kind of understand where I'm coming from with criticizing Jacob's ideas and kind of highlighting some of the critical thinking aspects here. Is I'm a licensed attorney as well. I practice law in Idaho. It's actually Idaho's birthday today, so it's Idaho Day. So I'm glad to be coming to you from the 43rd state.
What
And yeah,
anniversary is it?
it is the 187th, I think. I'd have to go back and look exactly, but yeah,
Okay, well,
it's
happy
been a while.
birthday, Idaho.
It's not 187th. That doesn't make any sense. The more I think about it, it's got to be less than that. I'd have to do the math. 1890 is when we became a state.
Well, Jacob
So
Hansen,
yeah,
the thing, he's such a bully. I mean, he sure gets his ass kicked a lot for being a bully. How does that
yeah,
work out?
yeah, he sure does. And one of the things about Jacob that's really interesting to me, and again, even though he's a bully, even though I don't particularly like him and find myself hate watching his content, pretty regularly. One of the reasons I want to do this is because even though I'm an ex-Mo, even though I'm a post-Mo, I'm not a member of the church anymore. My wife and I left the church in 2022 over its child sex abuse policies. We discussed that with John DeLynn on, I think it's episodes 1550 and 1551, if people want to check it out for really like why we left. But it's because even though, I'm outside, I still have people I care about on the inside. I still have coworkers that are members or believing members that I have great relationships with, friends that are believing members that I have great relationships with. And really, one of the reasons I want to respond to folks like Jacob Hansen, who are this like DesNat adjacent crowd in the church, I'd put Midnight Mormons into that same category, is frankly because I want them to lose. I want the Jim Bennett's and the Dan McClellans and the Dr. Julie Hanks, cadre of the church to win. Because in my view, and one of the reasons I feel so comfortable pushing back on folks like Jacob or the Midnight Mormons is because even as a believing member, I couldn't stand members like him that, really take their, they self-appoint themselves orthodoxy police of other people's behavior. And it just, to me, I don't understand how you can, spend so much time talking about Jesus and pull so little of what I view as Christ-like behavior out of the church. And so, yeah, you hit on the debate that we're going to touch on today. We're going to do responses to a few of the clips. Frankly, we're going to respond a lot more to Jacob Hansen than to Jacob Isbell. I would recommend, though, that people go watch the entire debate. It was streamed over at Midnight Mormons or whatever they call it now. What's the name you always call them? Yeah, that's right. Psych Ward Radio.
EWR.
And you can also view it at Jacob's channel, if you want to go give him some views. But you can go check out the entire debate because, I've listened to this multiple times and I'm not attempting at all to straw man his position. That's why we're going to play his clips while we respond to them. And so one of the things that's interesting to me about this debate is I've listened to a lot of the polygamy denier responses and content that both of you have done. And it's interesting to me because, in my work as an attorney, I've become really fascinated in combating conspiracy theories and misinformation. Civics education, outside of like my professional life, civics education is a big thing.
I'll bet it's a big thing. Sounds like something went bang there and now you've frozen. But in the meantime, I will say that one of the interesting things about this debate is that, of course, you're going to be picking apart the reasoning and the thinking errors of Jacob Hansen in this debate. The irony being that you and I and Bill both agree with his position in substance that Joseph Smith did, in fact, practice polygamy. And yet the way he gets there is sometimes convoluted and not always logical. Did you watch any of this debate, Bill?
Just the clips that were in the slideshow. So, I've debated Jacob a couple times myself, and I certainly know what you run into when you do that. And I don't really have much interest in watching much more of him. So
what do you run into? What was your takeaway from go ahead and tell the audience, because I know you had, I think it was planned to be a multi-part, but it didn't get as far as it was planned, that it got to was it 2 or 3 episodes and then he failed?
Yeah, we had 2 conversations. When you guys said earlier that Jacob's a bully, it's not only that he's a bully, and by the way, there you are, Kolby. It's not only that he's a bully in what he says to, pick on folks who are still in the church like Jim Bennett, or to do a video against Thomas Wayman. It's that when you're in a conversation with him, if he's not limited to time, he will not address the things you want to address. He insists you address the things he wants to. And when he gets tough questions, he will simply sidestep them, avoid them, and say those aren't going to be part of that conversation. And then the bigger thing, I think, is that he just takes up tons of time. If you go back and listen to the 2 conversations I had with him, I bet he spoke 70% of the time. And he does not really want it to be fair. He doesn't really want to address the things of the other side. And so he's sort of a bully from that point of view as well.
Well, in this particular debate, it looks like he set it up. He determined the rules, and he was the moderator in the debate. And Cardin's in the background. You never see Cardin. Cardin's running, I think, the camera and keeping time, because there are time limits, and each side gets a certain amount of time to do this and that, and they're held to it. So at least that part was organized and structured. Did you want to say anything else by way of introduction before we start with the slides, Kolby?
I guess just to jump off what Bill said, that's exactly what I've noticed about Jacob as well, is his antics strike me as someone who's a presuppositional apologist. And what that means is that he basically presumes things and then attempts to make his opponents always disprove everything about his position. And one of the things about, your conversation with him, Bill, because I listened to that entire thing actually twice. And it was really interesting that it stopped the minute you actually were allowed to start asking him some of the difficult questions and asking him to reconcile some of the different positions he's taken. And that's one of the things about apologists and apologetics that really frustrates me as an attorney, is that you have to take consistent positions. And Jacob doesn't. And we're going to highlight that multiple times tonight. And that's one of the reasons that it irritates me, is they never stick to one theory. They never stick to one falsifiable claim and ride it through. And if they want to just own the fact that these things are illogical and that it's not evidence-based, that's fine. But one of the reasons that we're doing this is because we'll see in Jacob's conversation with the polygamy denier crowd that he wants to use certain epistemological tools like historical precedent and evidence when it suits him. But then he turns around and opens the door for revelation, the idea of revelation being any type of acceptable evidence. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight is, and one of the reasons we're doing this, is to highlight what's known as the problem of inconsistent revelation, which is just the idea that once you open the door to revelation as a form of evidence, there's no way to close it, right? And so, I will say, I don't mean anything derogatory when I call the opposing crowd the polygamy denier crowd. That's in my view, that's what they are. That's their position. They deny that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, and frankly, there are parts of their position that I can completely sympathize with, and we'll talk about that. I'm sure both of you feel the same way. They're disgusted by the behavior that's recorded, and that I 100% completely agree with. But yeah, that's really what I wanted to say is, when we open the door to revelation as a mechanism for understanding truth, there's no way to close it. There's no way to reason with someone that's being completely illogical. And that's really, I think, what this entire exchange highlights, is that it's basically like you're playing a game of cards, some trick-taking game, right? And both people are claiming to have a trump card, but they can't show you the rules that tells you why revelation is a trump card. They just keep claiming over and over and over again that it is a trump card. And that's one of the things I think that distinguishes like a presuppositional apologist from maybe someone like Dan Peterson, who, even though I don't agree with many of his takes, they are at least attempting to present evidence, where, presuppositional apologists are really about putting people on the back foot. And Jacob has been very explicit about how that's his modus operandi all of the time. So
See,
I think the other thing that
I was going to say that I look at the same thing in a little bit of a different way, in that, typically speaking, one of the ironclad rules of historians, especially when they're dealing with religion, is that anything of a miraculous nature is off the table, because history cannot prove or disprove or support or dissupport a miracle, because they're outside the bounds of the historical method and historical analysis. So those are off limits. We'll talk about other things, but not about miracles. And what is a claim of revelation from God but a miracle? So I think that any claims of revelation should not be any part of a historical discussion or debate. And that's one of the other problems that I have, is that they are presenting, I almost said pretending, but that's not really fair. They're presenting as if they're having a debate about history, when frequently it becomes a religious debate and not a historical debate. It becomes a religious debate masquerading as a historical debate.
Yeah, and one of the things about those religious debates is, frankly, now as a non-believer, when I hear believers, whether it's, different sects of Mormonism, like we're going to listen to tonight, or it's Mormons against evangelicals. Frankly, to me, it just sounds like white noise at this point. Like it's like hearing two people debate whether Captain Kirk can beat Darth Vader in a fight. That's what it sounds like to me, because there's no evidence-based position to consider. It's just claims stacked on top of claims, stacked on top of claims.
And there's no
that's
debate there anyway, because Captain Kirk could beat Darth Vader, right? So,
of course.
I mean, it seems obvious to me.
Of course. So we've talked a little bit about our goals, but let's talk, I guess, more specifically about the goals that we're going to have tonight. I think the first is we're not here to adjudicate the history. I'm not a historian. As much as some lawyers like to think they're historians, we're not none of us here are historians. But we are going to talk about historical consensus. The other thing we're not going to do is determine who won the debate. And I kind of wanted to address why. It's because, and this might be surprising coming from a lawyer, but my view is that debate is 100% theatrics. And I have a background in debate. I did debate in both high school and college. And once you understand the tricks, they're very apparent. That's another thing about Jacob. When I've seen so many of his debates or so many of his conversations where he used debate tactics, is debate is not a mechanism to arrive at truth. And one of the reasons is because you can't do, in a live debate, you can't do what we're going to do tonight, which is go through and actually evaluate the claims in time. You can't do that, or with considerable time. You can't do that in a real time timed debate. And that's why it really favors folks like Jacob Hansen that are really, really, in favor of just stacking claim on claim on claim on claim. And so
he sometimes calls that a Gish Gallop.
Yeah. Named after the apologist, Dwayne Gish. That's right. Yep. They just throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and see what's.
But when he says it like it's a bad thing. I think for Jacob, it's a bad thing when other people do it.
Yeah, that's right. Our third goal is we're really going to evaluate the claims made by the debaters for logical consistency and kind of highlight the problem of, when you pick a lane, in Mormon apologetics, you got to stick with that lane. You got to ride that lane forward. And we'll point out, especially some of the positions that Jacob takes about the Old Testament are really, really problematic, or open some really, really problematic doors. And I would almost guarantee if you were pushed on that, he took that position out of convenience for this particular argument. And I doubt he would take it when we highlight some of the problems with it. And then last but not least, and we already kind of talked about this one a little bit more in depth, but it's to highlight the problem of inconsistent revelation. It's the idea that once you open the door for revelation being a mechanism to arrive at truth, you have no way to correct someone. And the biggest problem that can come from this, and this is an extreme, and I totally acknowledge this, that most religious believers don't go here, but that's where I view people like Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell. They were just tried like right in the courthouse where I used to practice as a prosecutor, or the Laffertys. Is once you allow for people to know things, and I'm putting that in the strongest of air quotes, know things in a way that they can't explain or justify to anyone else, it can open some really dangerous doors, frankly. And that's one of the things we want to highlight is when you're dealing with someone that just claims revelation, how do you reason with them? There's really no way.
Yes.
Any thoughts on those goals, or any goals?
Or the tiger? The doors opening, lady or the tiger. Unfortunately, personal revelation is more the tiger than the lady.
Right.
Yeah. And I think those are great, by the way.
But first, RFM, you had something from our friend Cultural Hall.
Yes, Cultural Hall has already joined our audience. I've seen a couple of comments be displayed on the screen from him, and we're taking a clip from this recent video he did, which is absolutely fantastic. Jacob is dazed and confused. This is a hate watch video from Cultural Hall, and we're just playing like a 3-minute clip so you can get introduced not only to Jacob and his bullying ways, but also to his opponent in the debate.
Jacob is known for two things: his terrible podcast and challenging complete strangers on Twitter to fight him or debate him. He's personally challenged me to at least a dozen debates, but I have a strict no debating douchebags policy. Here's one from when I posted this video about him.
Every dollar that the church uses is for humanitarian aid. The building of temples is a form of humanitarian aid if you really believe that temples and temple covenants do good for humanity. In fact, I would argue that the greatest poverty program in the world is the LDS temple program. Because when people make and keep covenants in temples, when our missionaries go and teach people to live the laws of the gospel, we actually fight poverty.
How dumb is that? Here's another one. He challenged me to debate after I posted this Brad Wilcox video.
The non-believers are the ones who will step on anybody they have to in order to get to their own selfish desire and reach their own selfish goal.
Kevin nailed this.
Debating with taint is literally the least important thing that anyone can do and is literally the largest waste of time. One could stare at a blank wall for hours, years even, and that still wouldn't be as much of a waste of time as debating with taint for a few minutes.
Remember when I said Jacob challenged strangers to fights? This guy made fun of him, so we challenged him to a boxing match. Here's Jacob cosplaying as a boxer. And here's Jacob with a nice black eye after getting his ass kicked.
Aww.
He also got his ass kicked by this guy. They challenged each other to an MMA match. It didn't go well for Taint. He got submitted by chokehold within about a minute.
Frustrated because I don't have room to work and try to work a submission. So as he holds on to me tight, I say, hey, let's go ahead and take Jacob Hansen for a ride.
Let the bodies hit them. Let the bodies hit them. Let the bodies hit them.
Fatality.
Now, not only is that a great introduction to Jacob Hansen, but Jacob Isbell, the guy who just took Jacob Hansen for a ride, is the same guy who's going to be debating him on the subject of whether Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. So you will recognize him in the video sitting opposite Jacob Hansen as they go at it.
That's right. One last thought before we get to the clips on the problem of inconsistent revelation that I wanted to note, and maybe a callback to an episode you and I, or actually it was 3 episodes. You were nice enough to invite me on for 1 episode, and I stayed on for 3 because that's how I do it. RFM.
I'm widely known for my niceness.
Yeah. Yes. But yeah, one of the things that we did is we did a series called Mormonism and the Rules of Evidence, and one of the things I wanted to touch on about the problem of inconsistent revelation is one of the reasons that as an attorney, I look at the rules of evidence in evaluating some of the claims of Mormonism, some of the evidence of Mormonism, is because there would be some people probably in the chat who will say something like, well, how dare you judge religion by the standards of man? And my point is that the rules of evidence and the common law, the idea of the common law, is something that's evolved over hundreds of years that humans have used to arrive at the best way to determine facts. And so in a way, what I'm saying is I don't believe that God would be so ineffectual that humans could arrive at a better way of determining facts than supposedly all-powerful creator God of the universe. And so I view it as a good analog or a good way to keep the principles in mind. Obviously, the rules aren't strictly applicable, but it's to take principles from the rules of evidence, from the legal field, and to apply those to how to evaluate evidence, because that's exactly what attorneys like you and I do. And one of the things that I really want to highlight when we allow for revelation as a mechanism to understand truth is there are very few areas in the law where there's not a lot of exceptions. But one of them that's almost absolute is that if someone's going to get up in a courtroom and they're going to testify, that witness is going to be required to have personal knowledge of the things that they are going to be testifying about. And one of the reasons for that is there's a rule of evidence that requires it. And one of the ways, that attorneys typically will determine how a person has personal knowledge of something is they'll just ask the simple question, how do you know what you're going to testify about? Like, how have you reached that conclusion? And one of the things that's so frustrating to me about revelation, or one of the reasons that I don't view it as a real mechanism to arrive at truth, is because when you ask someone how they know something that they've received by revelation, they usually just continue to assert that they do know it. They won't actually explain to you beyond saying something like a feeling or I've received an answer to a prayer. There's no real There's no real mechanism to understand how they've reached that conclusion. And this presumption in the law is so strong that there's like an entire other rule of evidence about hearsay and regarding hearsay and exceptions to hearsay that are very related to this idea of personal knowledge.
I got to tell you, if somebody were to testify that God told them something, I would immediately object on the grounds of hearsay.
That's right. That's right. And so the analogy that I thought of is, picture we've got a witness on the stand there. And, you were a criminal attorney, RFM, I was for a time. And, you've got a witness up there and you ask, ma'am, how do you know that the defendant killed the victim? And she just responds back, I just do. I just know with every fiber of my being. It's not at all going to be convincing. And that's, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful to people's religious beliefs, because again, I still have very close relationships with believers. I understand that people find meaning in these narratives, and I'm not trying to take that away from people. But when we're talking about whether things are actually true, that's what I care about. I care about whether we can actually demonstrate these things. And I guess just another little small callback is a few months ago, you both had Sean McCraney on to share his point of view. And I appreciated listening to him. He's a very interesting character.
You called in, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. And he was nice enough to humor some of my epistemological questions. And I really highlighted the same problem there, which is, if you're just insisting to know something, that's not enough for someone like me that really cares because they really believed that the church was literally, in fact, true. That's just not enough for me. So if you're willing to make an admission that, a piece of evidence that because in that example, Sean had said that his biggest evidence of his experience was the change that he'd experienced. And I immediately asked Sean, do you acknowledge that people can change their lives for false beliefs? And he said, yes. And in my mind, immediately, you have to have something else. If you acknowledge that the reason that you believe something can be false, then you've got to have some other reason that you continue to believe. Otherwise, It just doesn't make any sense to me. It seems like you're by definition being illogical. But
that's kind of the no further questions, Your Honor moment.
That's right. That's right. So let's talk about what revelation is. I pulled this quote from Thomas Paine's Age of Reason, in part because I think it's a crime that so little people understand Thomas Paine's significance to America, frankly, and tomorrow's the 4th of July, so I wanted to pull this. If you don't know, Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense that was, I wouldn't say it was entirely responsible for the American Revolution, but it definitely was a large contributing factor. I think it's a shame that people don't recognize that even though, he was a British citizen and kind of died in disrepute because of his views that he published in this book, this pamphlet, really, 1794, Age of Reason, which you can find for free online. The copyright's long since passed. He really died, even though he was so fundamental to America's founding. It's funny, he really died almost in exile, with Thomas Jefferson really being one of his only friends. There were, in fact, only 6 people that attended his funeral. And one of my favorite stories about him is on his deathbed, he was asked by the doctor if he wished to accept Jesus before his passing. And he said quietly, "I have no wish to believe on that subject." So Thomas Paine, I'm pulling this right from Age of Reason, where he talks about what I think are some of the problems with revelation. So I'll just read here. He says, every national church or religion has established itself by pretending some special mission from God, communicated to certain individuals. The Jews have their Moses, the Christians their Jesus Christ, the apostles and saints, and the Turks their Muhammad, as if the way to God was not open to every man alike. And I would pause here and just highlight, Thomas Paine actually wasn't an atheist, even though he was accused often of being an atheist. He was a deist, and so he believed that it was organized religion that was the problem. He actually didn't have a problem with finding meaning in this connectedness between all living things and a creator God. He goes on to say each of those churches show certain books which they call revelation or the word of God. The Jews say that the word of God was given to Moses face to face. The Christians say that their word of God came by divine inspiration. And the Turks say that their word of God, the Quran, was brought by an angel from heaven. Each of those churches accuse the other of unbelief. And for my part, I disbelieve them all. That really highlights this problem of inconsistent revelation, right? As it is necessary to affix right ideas to words, I will, before I proceed further into the subject, offer some other observations on the word revelation. Revelation, when applied to religion, means something communicated immediately to God from man. No one will deny. I'm sorry, did I reverse those?
Yeah,
no one will deny. No one will deny or dispute the power of the Almighty to make such a communication, if he pleases, but admitting for the sake of a case that something has been revealed to a certain person and not revealed to any other person, it is revelation to that person only. When he tells it to a second person, a second to a third to a fourth, and so on, it ceases to be revelation to all those persons. It is a revelation to the first person only, and hearsay to every other, and consequently, they are not obliged to believe it. It is a contradiction in terms and ideas to call anything a revelation that comes to us at second hand, either verbally or in writing. Revelation is necessarily limited to the first person communication. After this, it is only an account of something which that person says was made a revelation to him. And though he may find himself obliged to believe it, it cannot be incumbent on me to believe it in the same manner, for it was not a revelation made to me, and I have only his word for that it was made to him. Do you have any thoughts on that quote, RFM?
Well, wouldn't the Mormon response to this be that Joseph Smith came up with the antidote to this argument, which is that every member of the church is supposed to get their own personal revelation, confirming the revelation that was received by Joseph Smith, and so on, at least up till President Nelson?
I mean, they'll absolutely claim that when it's convenient. Absolutely. But a lot more, we've been seeing, I would say, messages in the church of you already know, or you getting no answer is actually your answer all along. And so that's where I think, Thomas Paine's comments are really pointed about both the problem of inconsistent revelation and then just the problem of someone claiming that they've received revelation. All we have is their word. Oh, it's nice to see
Julie Hanks said something. Can we read that? Can I read that? I'll read that.
Yeah, go
Julie
ahead.
Hanks says, Jacob, and this is, I believe, Jacob Hansen, has bullied me, written letters to my area authority and stake president trying to get me excommunicated. Wow, what a dick. Made multiple videos about me. Thanks for challenging him. Okay.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you were here, Julie, when we started, but I specifically mentioned you by name as, even though I'm not a believer anymore, I am one of the reasons I wanted to do this, and RFM and Bill have been nice enough to host me, is because Jacob's a bully. And because even though I'm a post-Mormon, I still have love for people like you who are in the church. I completely understand why you find meaning in it. And I want your strain of Mormonism to win. I don't want the Jacob Hansen, the Ward Radio, frankly, the Dallin Oaks strain of authoritarianism to continue in the church, because there are some amazing people in the church, and the church can improve people's lives in certain ways. I still think it's false, but I want to acknowledge that that's why we're doing this, is because, when he's going to say some really silly things, we're going to highlight those really silly things.
All right. Well, let's start highlighting some things. What do you say?
Well, first, we're going to do one more video, and then we will go there.
So, and one of the great opponents of the Islamic totalitarianism in ancient Persia was the great Omar Khayyam, perhaps the greatest poet of old Persia, whose Rubaiyat, I'm sure, is known at least to some of you. And my favorite verse of this comes from the Robert Le Gallienne translation, and it takes the form of a question. The quatrain is in the form of a question. It says, "And do you think that unto such as you, a maggot-minded, starved, fanatic crew, God gave a secret and denied it me? Well, well, what matters it? Believe that too." To this magnificent astronomer and scientist and physician and humanist of Persia, who opposed the cruel, sadistic, verminous, ignorant mullahs of his day, I borrow the question: what is your authority for saying that you know something that I don't?
Yeah, and for those who are unfamiliar or haven't heard that Omar Khayyam quote before, that was shared by Christopher Hitchens, author Christopher Hitchens. He passed away in 2012. Meet and have a conversation with. But one of the reasons I wanted to highlight that is because I think it just undergirds the problem of people claiming special knowledge. Is if you can't explain how you know something, at that point, okay, go ahead and believe that. I can't disprove it to you. But, going back to Paine's comments, or to the point of this entire quatrain, why should I care, right? And so I think that Hitchens quote really can help set the stage for reviewing the rest of the clips.
Is it okay if I jump in here with my mother's favorite quatrain from the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam?
It's your show. How could I stop you?
I know it's not quite on point, but hey, it's for my mom. Okay, here it is. It's one of regret as opposed to religious revelation. The moving finger writes, and having writ moves on. Nor all your piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all your tears wash out a word of it.
Nice.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Yeah. I love both of those quotes. And I think they really just highlight, I love the way that Christopher Hitchens asked that, because he's in that exchange. He's actually debating with a Christian apologist, Frank Turek. And you can see the sincerity. He's saying, how do you claim to know something that you can't explain to me? I think that's one of the differences between, using logic and reason and evidence is I'm happy to, anything I'm going to claim to know, I am happy to walk people through the evidence and why I've reached that conclusion. If I can't do that, then it's not something I'm going to claim to know, frankly. It's going to be something that I claim to believe. So let's start with our clips on Jacob Hansen and Jacob Isbell. We'll start, this first clip is a section of Jacob Hansen's opening.
See, there he is. You recognize him? There's Jacob Hansen and Jacob Isbell, the guy who just totally plastered Jacob Hansen to the mat in that snowstorm on General Conference weekend just this past April.
Yeah, here it is.
So, did Joseph Smith practice polygamy? The answer is yes. He did. The evidence is clear. Let's start with Doctrine and Covenants 132. This was a revelation given to Joseph Smith for his wife Emma, who is struggling with accepting the practice of plural marriage. The bottom line is this. If Section 132 was written by Joseph Smith, this debate is over, okay? It proves that Joseph practiced polygamy. So my opponent will ignore the evidence and simply assume that because the revelation was only made public in 1852, that it must not be from Joseph. Now, the church claims that the revelation was received on July 12th, 1843. Why would they do that? Well, because in Joseph's own journal, it's written down. It says on July 12th, 1843, received a revelation in the office in presence of Hiram and William Clayton. But what was that revelation about? Well, William Clayton went home that night and wrote down the following. William Clayton's July 12th, 1843 journal entry reads, "This AM wrote a revelation consisting of 10 pages on the order of the priesthood, showing the designs in Moses, Abraham, David, and Solomon having many wives and concubines." Okay, so we have two contemporaneous journal entries confirming it was received July 12th, 1843. But wait, there's more. You see, the next month in August, they held a high council meeting in Nauvoo. Can my opponent tell you what they discussed in that meeting? No. And he will avoid discussing this high council meeting because everyone who was in that meeting said that Section 132 was introduced at that meeting. But maybe these people were all part of Brigham Young's cabal of murderous polygamists plotting to take over the church. Oop, sorry. Actually, no. William Marks, Austin Cowles, and Leonard Sobey were all in that meeting, and they were shocked when they heard Section 132 read. And all of them eventually left the church. So why would these three anti-polygamists say that Hiram read Section 132 in that meeting? You can't say they were part of Brigham's plot. These guys were anti-polygamists. We even have Franklin Richards' journal entry from that very day, August 12th, 1843, saying that the meeting discussed the reestablishment of the Old Testament practice of ancient Israel where a brother would take on more than one wife to raise up seed.
I saw you smiling and giggling a little bit, Bill. Is it because Jacob's been cribbing from your homework there? I think you're muted.
What he's saying is that he can't believe that Jacob would be such a low-down snake in the grass as to steal Bill's work. Isn't that what you were saying, Bill?
Yeah, in fact, I put it up on here on the screen. Me wonders where Hansen got his details. Cough, cough, Reel and RFM. Because he essentially took the absolute argument that the two of us made in doing all this work against polygamy. But as you point out, he doesn't want to give us any credit. He doesn't want to mention our names. He just, as you pointed, he just cribbed it. That's all he did.
The thing that jumped out at me at the end there was where he's quoting from, who was the journal entry?
Leonard Sobey?
No.
Franklin Richards. Franklin Richards. It's on the next slide, though, RFM, that we'll hit that.
Thank you, where he's talking about the Levirate kind of if a man dies, no, hang on a second here. What is it? If a man has a brother and the brother is married and the brother dies and the brother dies and the brother dies, then under the law of Moses, then it's this man's duty to take the now deceased brother's wife and raise up seed unto him. And yet, that rather straightforward statement, it seemed kind of straightforward, gets interpreted by Jacob Hansen as something in support of plural marriage.
Yeah, let's look at it. Actually, it's on our next slide. Bill,
which is why I repeated and he dies, because it's not plural marriage if you're, well, I guess it is kind of plural marriage, isn't it? Because you're taking another wife, but it's from your deceased brother.
Well, and that's one of the things I wanted to point out, right? And one of my favorite clips of all time regarding Mormonism, and I'm going to analogize to that because to what Jacob just did, because it's very similar, is when Michael Sweeney with the BBC asks Elder Holland about Mitt Romney, doing the temple penalties. And it's like you can see Elder Holland in real time. You can see the little hamster inside his head realize that he's got to lie. Like he lies, he says no, and then he says he did not. It's something like that. Like, no, he did not, or sorry, we do not have penalties in the temple, but that's not what he was asked. Right. He was asked, did they? And Jacob does a very similar thing here, where as he starts looking at the quote on the screen, he won't just read it. He has to equivocate and say that this Liverite marriage, like you hit on, RFM, it's an Old Testament practice about raising up seed to a brother to ensure that there's an heir, right? Because that was like the obsession in that day and age outside of religion. This has no basis in DNC 132. I went and looked at DNC 132. Both of you have looked at DNC 132 again, or looked at it multiple times. There's nothing about Liverite marriage in there at all. The only use of the word brother is actually in verse 55. And the use of that word in that verse is talking about how if you listen to Joseph, God's going to give you 100-fold of mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and kids, which is one of the reasons that I hate DNC 132, and I hated it as a believing member, is because it essentially, it basically makes the argument or operates from the presupposition or the premise that just the number of family members or the number of children or the number of spouses you have is important, as if, it's not the individual unique relationship. It treats people like they're knickknacks or property to collect. And the reason I wanted to highlight this is if this has no basis in 132, this Levirate marriage, why is Jacob using it as evidence that DNC 132 is what Franklin Richards heard in that August 12th meeting? In fact, this evidence, if you really look at it and think about it, it actually supports, and I can't believe I'm saying this is actually a piece of evidence that would support the polygamy deniers' view that there's some other revelation or some other something that's going on with these contemporaneous records. Yeah. Any thoughts on that, RFM? Is that essentially the point you were trying to make?
I think that you made it much better. I could certainly see it as a possibility that even though this particular instance from the Old Testament did not make its way into section 132, that this may have been some kind of an argument that was bandied about from the scriptures to support plural marriage. But it didn't make it into section 132. And I could see Jacob Isbell turning around and saying, well, I will see your affidavits from the Nauvoo expositor, which do match what's in 132, and I will raise you your own quote from Franklin D. Richards' journal, which does not match what's in section 132.
Right. And my point is, and you're right, that's probably a very reasonable explanation for what may have occurred, but that's just an argument from silence, right? We're arguing based on just possibilities at that point. This, in my view, especially because, as we'll hit on later, again, Jacob Hansen is going to crib from your work on the the relationship between the Nauvoo expositor affidavits and Doctrine and Covenants 132, and he's going to repeatedly demand that Jacob Isbell explain why there's such a correlation between the two. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to use correlation as your criteria, Jacob, then guess what? Sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. You need to stick with what your criteria is. And again, I'm not saying that Franklin D. Richards is actually talking about some different revelation here. I'm just saying when we're talking about evidence, we need to be honest about what it says. This does not support the argument that Jacob's advancing, not really, at least not with an explanation. And so at best we can say this is consistent with some conjecture, some unproven conjecture. That's the best we can say.
Right. And I would say it may be just a little bit better than an argument from silence, because according to this journal entry, Hiram isn't going before the High Council and talking about the story of the Battle of Jericho and circling around the wall 7 times and the walls coming down. It does seem to have something to do with taking more wives. And when Joseph Smith, according to other documents, is marrying the wives of other men, one wonders if this might have been used as a justification for that.
It's possible. But again,
but
we're just dealing with possibility, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't say
it's
the
not,
seal's the deal.
Right. It's not there explicitly in the evidence. So we're just using conjecture.
And I'm going to just agree, just to reiterate what you said, Kolby, which is, if you're going to use this as evidence and say what was going on, this seems clearly not exactly 132. Hence, it actually fits the argument of the other side better, that it could be seen as whatever's being said here seems to represent something different than 132, which would make more sense in terms of being a different revelation or a different document.
Right. And I'm taking Jacob's argument at face value, right? Because he said that DNC 132 is what was read at that August 12th, 1843 meeting. If that's the case, and DNC 132 doesn't have anything to do with what's talked about in Franklin Richards' journal, then that needs to be explained. And of course, you can use conjecture to arrive there, but that's not what the evidence says. And we should just be honest about what it has. And the thing that I guess I'd highlight is I'm not actually disagreeing with Jacob's overall conclusion. I agree with him that the evidence very much supports that Joseph Smith both was the author of Doctrine and Covenants 132 and that he practiced polygamy. It's just that we need to be honest about what this evidence is, and we shouldn't overstate the case, because when we do that, it actually further invites people into this conspiracy theory line of thinking. It tells them that there's a there, that they need to keep fighting, that they're the warriors for truth. And that's one of the reasons that I think we should be honest about the evidence. He already had one journal entry that was contemporaneous. He didn't need to overstate what's in Franklin D. Richards' journal.
Right. And Jacob Hansen started off that clip by saying the evidence is clear that Joseph Smith authored section 132.
He also said that this debate is over because if Joseph Smith was the author of DNC 132, then Joseph Smith absolutely practiced polygamy. And while I agree with him in a probability sense, and I agree that was the case, I actually don't know how you go from Joseph Smith authored DNC 132, therefore he absolutely practiced polygamy. There's no logical syllogism that I could construct or that I can think of that says if Joseph Smith was the author of DNC 132, then he also absolutely practiced polygamy.
Yeah.
Right. And like you said, it probably, and I think Jacob Isbell goes down that same road as yours, saying, no, it doesn't mean it absolutely, but yeah, I'm not going to argue about it because it probably means that. I mean, it talks about if you have this commandment revealed to you and you don't follow it, then you're going to be destroyed. And the only way you can have exaltation is by following it once it's been revealed to you. Yeah, it looks like Joseph Smith wouldn't have written that without entering into it himself, either after or before that revelation was given. But yes, I take your point.
Right. And we also know that if we were to go through the other historical evidence, even Doctrine and Covenants 132, the section heading to 132, that was received in 1843, but the church has a line at the end of the heading that essentially says, even though this was received in 1843, some principles in it were revealed to the prophet as soon as 1831. And so that's another reason I think that you could say, well, Joseph Smith could have been practicing polygamy and not been the author of DNC 132, right? And so I just think there's kind of an over representation of what this evidence stands for. Yeah. This next clip is where Jacob Hansen talks about the Nauvoo expositor evidence, and I think it will look very familiar to people who've watched your episode on it or your Sunstone presentation, RFM, because I think it's basically exactly the same.
I hope he highlights the different affidavits in different colors together with their corresponding sections in the Doctrine and Covenants section 132, like I did.
Fingers crossed that that's what he does.
He should have just used our images, right? He shouldn't have even created his own. He wasted time doing that because he's obviously taking from our material.
Well, they look familiar.
If you want to stump a polygamy denier, just ask them what happened in the August 1843 High Council meeting in Nauvoo. All the historical evidence says that on August 12th, 1842, Section 132 was read to the High Council. And then some of that High Council leaked Section 132 to the Nauvoo expositor. How do we know this? Well, because the Nauvoo expositor quotes parts of 132 and hits on all of its major themes in detail. We can go through these in more time. I don't have time now to go through all of it. Now, obviously, the Nauvoo expositor contains falsehood, but good liars mix truth and falsehoods. And it's obvious that Section 132 had been leaked to them. The question for my opponent is, how did the quotes from Section 132 end up in the May 1844 Nauvoo expositor? Tonight, you will watch my opponent run like crazy from this question, because it's proof that Section 132 was not written after Joseph Smith's death.
Can I just say, before you jump in, can I just say, if as far as I know, RFM, you were the very first person to connect these dots and to make this the awareness of the Nauvoo expositor having such a similarity to DNC 132. And suddenly here we are, whatever it is, 8 months later, 9 months later, and suddenly Jacob Hansen has formed the exact same argument, but somehow doesn't know to say where he got it from. That just seems strange to me. Anyway, go ahead.
I know, but that's okay. We all know where he got it. He doesn't have to say it, that he got it from me, Radio Free Mormon. But, you know, it's a debate. And I know that in debates, we don't always have time to pick our words carefully. I was going to just say that the Nauvoo expositor was not in May. It came out on June 7th, 1844. The date of the affidavits were in May, but it was published in the one and only edition of the Nauvoo expositor in June. So he also talks about, I know there are falsehoods in the Nauvoo expositor. I'm not familiar with what those falsehoods are. In fact,
that was the
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say that was the exact reason I highlighted this clip, because I will at least, so Jacob never credits you during the entire debate, but I will say he at least acknowledges that he's borrowing from other people's work. And I remember him mentioning Brian Hales and Don Bradley by name. He doesn't mention either of you, but he does at least say, like, I'm not a scholar or a historian of these things, so I'm just a presenter of, you know, the consensus view. And so he does at least acknowledge, he's not claiming, I guess, in the debate, I'll say to his defense, that this was like his original research. But that was the thing that I wanted to highlight, is he says, you know, obviously the Nauvoo expositor contains falsehoods. And I'm like, what are they? Like, I'd love to know what those falsehoods are, because I've read them, and obviously they're very strongly worded, and there's a lot of matters of opinion, but I don't know what the falsehoods are. I've reviewed those affidavits, and I've reviewed the entire thing multiple times. And frankly, I think William and Jane Law are heroes that came out of Mormonism. It's one of the things that makes me still proud to claim some cultural heritage inside of Mormonism, that there were people like him or B.H. Roberts or Talmage, people that were very brave and that bucked the trend and bucked the self-appointed orthodoxy police like Jacob.
I think if you want to nitpick the expositor, Jane Law, for instance, says that you can have up to 10 wives, whereas really all it's saying is if a man married 10 wives. And so she may have, you know, read it and then tried to recount it and sort of misremembered, but it's such a small one-off that to say that there are, you know, lies or inaccuracies in there is not really the truth.
Right.
And also, just this isn't, I don't think, a minor point, but Jacob Hansen says that somebody leaked it. Well, William Law says who the somebody was, and it was Hiram Smith, who gave him a copy of the Revelation and left it with him over the weekend or for a couple days to peruse, which he did with his wife, which is where they got their knowledge from of the contents before they gave it back to them. And the third person who signs the affidavit says that his knowledge comes not from that source, but that I believe that he was present in that August 12th meeting. And so he's going off
that's Austin Cowles, isn't it?
Yes, he's going off his recollection from the meeting when Hiram Smith read it then, I believe.
Yeah, and one additional piece of evidence I think that we can point to that supports your research on the Nauvoo expositor in DNC 132 is that part of the affidavits are the allegation that there was some potential like polygamous relationship between William and Emma. And there's this weird line in Doctrine and Covenants 132 about how God supposedly is saying that, Emma was offered certain things and then now it was only a test. And so I think that's one way that you could point to another relationship between DNC 132 and the Nauvoo Expositor affidavits that I don't know. I've never heard from the believing side what that line about, Emma staying faithful to the things she's already been given means. I don't understand from a faithful context what that would mean aside from the link between the laws.
From a faithful
Emma.
context, just so you understand, Kolby, the answer to your question is what it means is anything other than that.
Anything other than what it most likely means. Yeah.
Yes. There's no relationship even proposed by God or Joseph between Emma and William Law. That's the one thing it doesn't mean.
Yeah. And I think if we go to the next clip, we can kind of get, I think it's the last thought of Jacob's closing.
You see, the problem for my opponent is that even the people who hated Brigham Young said Joseph practiced it. For instance, while Emma and the RLDS group denied Joseph's polygamy, the Strangites, William Smith, and those who followed Lyman Wright to Texas all held that Joseph introduced plural marriage. They weren't part of Brigham's plot. That's why no credentialed historians are on my opponent's side. But there's another thing to consider here, and that's the scriptures. We are the only Christian sect that accounts for plural marriage in the Bible. The Book of Mormon teaches it correctly. In Jacob 2, it condemns polygamy and sets monogamy as the norm. But Jacob also states that if God feels it necessary, he will command plural marriage. Otherwise, we are to hearken to the norm of monogamy. Does my opponent realize the house of Israel was literally a polygamous household? That's right. Jacob had multiple wives. So did Abraham. So did Moses. So did a long list of people favored by God in the scriptures. Nathan the prophet says that the Lord gave David his wives. You can look up the reference, 2 Samuel 12:7.
I think you cut off a little bit earlier, but that's completely fine. I think there are a few different parts in that clip I wanted to go. The first is I think it's hilarious to talk about how there's no credentialed historians on your opponent's side while calling and having on your slide that Lyman White is Lyman Wright and stating it incorrectly. I just thought that was hilarious.
Yes, unfortunately, he didn't just state it. That was his own slide that he had prepared and that had Lyman Wright.
I've known it was Lyman White about 2 weeks after I was baptized. I mean, Jacob, you just got to read a little bit more and know the names of the folks in church history.
Yeah, Wikipedia is a modern marvel. You can type in anybody's name and find them. The other thing I just think is funny is that it immediately goes from don't believe these guys because they have no credentialed historians on their side to now let's talk about the scriptures.
Yeah, I mean, where do the scriptures come in? This is a perfect transition of what I was talking about. You may have been going out and trying to come back in at the time I was bringing it up and I was filling for time, which is this whole idea. We're talking about history. Oh, let's look at what the scriptures say.
Right.
What does it have to do with anything? He's treating Abraham as if he's a real historical figure.
Right.
And then he's also twisting things a bit, which I'll let you talk about as far as Abraham's practice of polygamy.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other piece, especially because we've talked about, Jacob's bullying conduct, he is constantly making videos against Dan McClellan. And I love Dan's content. And, he's still, I don't know how believing he is, but he's still an active member of the church that I think is really helping to educate people on the historical context. And he has a wealth of historical knowledge and training. And so I just think it's hilarious that when it suits Jacob's argument, he cares about what credentialed historians think. But when it doesn't suit his argument or he wants to attack the LGBT community, he doesn't care at all about what credentialed historians think and will make attack videos against people in his own church. It just shows the special pleading that's built into this worldview of I'm going to pick a type of evidence when it benefits my argument, and I'm not going to use it when it cuts against my argument. That's not a consistent criterion. You're just picking and choosing at random. You're just working backwards from a conclusion, right?
Right.
And so I think before we talk about his scriptural support idea, because you're right, RFM, I did put together some slides kind of highlighting, the problems with his scriptural support idea. We need to highlight how I think this is another time that Jacob is overstating his evidence. He's using Jacob 2:30 as a piece of evidence, this loophole that he argues is there, that God can command polygamy. But Joseph Smith's polygamy doesn't fulfill the purpose that's laid out in Jacob 2:30. And Jacob's going to offer his own view on that. I'm not trying to straw man his view. He says, that raise up seed means to rise up a special generation. And my question would be, then why doesn't it say to raise up a special generation? It says to raise up seed.
Why would God have a problem at any point in human history of raising up a special generation? Why is that something that's only going to be every now and again when God commands it? That's what I would ask Jacob.
Exactly. It's just a convenient excuse, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a conjecture explanation. It's an ad hoc explanation that they just can use because it sounds credible, but it doesn't make any sense when you really think about it. To borrow a phrase from another debate, and we'll have a clip from it later that I really enjoyed, if you're going to move the goalposts after, you definitely still can't miss. And that's one of the things that I think is funny about his use of Jacob 2:30. And as Jacob Isbell will correctly point out during the audience Q&A portion, this scripture that Jacob is relying on also is conditioned on God giving a command. That's what Jacob 2:30 says, that if I will have people be polygamous, that's Jacob's view on it. Jacob Isbell has a different take. I will command my people. And
Yes.
He can't demonstrate a command. So he can't demonstrate a command. And he also can't demonstrate that Joseph Smith's polygamy fulfilled the explicit purpose that the loophole is given for. And that's one of the things that I wanted to highlight. For non-believers, we just think that Joseph Smith is either lying about these revelatory experiences for his personal reasons, or even, I'm a big fan of Dan Vogel's work and Dan Vogel's pious fraud theory, which, that maybe Joseph was sincerely mistaken in some of these things, or maybe he started out sincere and things went to his head. It's really difficult to tell exactly how that works. But my point is just, it's not as simple as just, Joseph Smith was either completely lying about everything or he was completely honest about everything. And so one of the things about, operating kind of as a skeptic and trying to use logic and reason here is I can use one epistemological tool to knock off both Jacob's arguments at once. It's that I don't believe in revelation. And if you don't believe in revelation, it's really easy to just say, I don't believe in either of these things. But one of the reasons that they're having this debate is because they both believe that their position is supported by what God has told them. How do you resolve an argument like that, right? Both people are claiming a trump card.
Mm-hmm.
Can I also just add too, and somebody's making the argument in the comments, but in a courtroom where you're trying to convince the jury of the most rational view, the jury would almost assuredly see that Joseph Smith is both the author of the Book of Mormon and the author of D&C 132. Hence, using the Book of Mormon to substantiate as a second witness for 132 doesn't make any sense, because you have the same mind creating the same theology. Hence, monogamy is the standard. But when I, Joseph Smith, the prophet, command people to do polygamy, we do polygamy. Could also be the light in the lens which you see the Book of Mormon through.
Yeah. You basically have what you're saying, Bill, if I understand you, is you basically have one epistemic touch point, right? You have Joseph Smith's word. And whether it's in the Book of Mormon or whether it's in D&C 132, you're relying on one person's credibility. And when you really evaluate that person's credibility in totality, that's a real problem. Even from the believing standpoint, I mean, I really view the evidence that comes out of the 1826 glass liquor trial in South Bainbridge as so difficult to not, even from the faithful perspective, to not acknowledge that Joseph Smith and the people who supported him, and I'm actually talking about the evidence that comes from the notes of the testimony in support of him, from his father and from Josiah Stoll.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe in magic sinking treasure, but both of these people did. And they both used that testimony to support Joseph Smith. And so it's not as simple as like, were these people, well respected, or were they, did they have a previous reputation for being honest? I don't believe in sinking treasure. And as far as I know, most people who live in this day and age don't either. And so those are very important things to consider when we're looking back. Apologists cry presentism all the time. But if we're really going to go back and look in the historical context, we've really got to go back and look in the historical context and recognize that these people were backwoods frontiers people that believed in some really crazy shit. They just did. And if
Past
you
is
don't,
a foreign country, they do things differently there.
yeah, exactly. And if you don't use that to evaluate whether that lines up with what you believe today, you're just willing to take people at their word that there was sinking treasures and feathers and underneath buried treasure. I mean, this stuff is crazy that people can understand this and still believe, to me. But anyways, let's turn to our scriptural support idea. So here's the scripture in Genesis that actually talks about the, Abraham, because like you said, RFM, I think Jacob's really overstating what's in the actual story in the Bible about Abraham and polygamy. Here's what it says in DNC 132. Do you want to read those two verses for us, RFM?
Sure. From Doctrine and Covenants 132, God commanded Abraham, and Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham to wife. And why did she do it? Because this was the law, and from Hagar sprang many people. This, therefore, was fulfilling, among other things, the promises. Was Abraham therefore under condemnation? Verily, I say unto you, nay, for I, the Lord, commanded it. So it's twice, once at the beginning, once at the end of the passage, saying that God commanded Abraham to practice polygamy.
Right. And then when we actually turn to Genesis 16, which I'll read, where it actually records what, at least what Genesis
what
says.
really happened is what you were going to say.
Well, yeah, at least what's reported to have happened,
Yeah.
right? If we're viewing these things as presenting a consistent narrative, they just don't. And this is what Genesis says. Now, Sarai, Abraham's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. So what I'm highlighting here is whether it's Jacob's argument or what's explicitly in DNC 132, there is no commandment that was given to Abraham. And this is actually something, because polygamy affects everybody in the church. It affects men and women in different ways. But this is something that's very important to my wife to highlight, even though she's also not a believer, is there's no command in the Old Testament for the practice of polygamy. There just isn't. The only scripture that Jacob, and it was touched on right at the end of that clip, the only scripture that Jacob can really get close to is a reference to Nathan and Samuel. But it is very vague, and it's very difficult to see it as an explicit command. And for the argument that like God doesn't command things, like look at the Old Testament. It's full of God commanding people to do things all of the time. So we know that that's in the model. Sorry, RFM, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was just going to say, I had looked at that also about Nathan the prophet giving David the king his wives. When actually it says that Nathan is saying the Lord gave these to you together with all this other property and all these other things. And it seems when I read it now more like this is what happened when you became king. And Nathan is attributing all of that to God, giving it to David, as opposed to necessarily God commanding it. I think that God's opinion about all these different wives that Solomon had was quite negative, and I don't know why it'd be any different with David.
Right. And, to go back to Bill's comment about this one epistemic touch point being Joseph Smith, one other thing I'd point to, I don't have it in the slides, but people should also look at the happiness letter. And I know that there's questions about whether Joseph Smith actually wrote the happiness letter. The church has claimed that Joseph Smith wrote the happiness letter and quoted from it repeatedly. Monson quoted from it all the time. Many different leaders have quoted from it all the time. And that presents an entirely different view where it actually says, it uses some phrase about how someone who would call polygamy wicked knows only part of heaven's will or something like that. I know that on John DeLen's Mormon Stories with the LDS discussion series, they talk about it in their happiness letter episode, right. But it just highlights this entire, evolving narrative in Joseph Smith's view. There's one other prophet that repeatedly Jacob talks about being polygamous, and that's Moses. As far as I know, there's no record in the Old Testament that Moses is polygamous. There's kind of a vague reference. Yeah, there's a reference to him marrying a Cushite. That's right. That's what I was going to hit. But it doesn't explicitly say that someone different from Zipporah. I think we can assume that safely because Zipporah was obviously Jethro's daughter. But anyways, my point is just if we're going to repeatedly claim, like Jacob is doing, that God commanded this in the Old Testament, you should be able to point to a command, and there just isn't one there as far as I can see.
I was thinking Asenath, pardon the pronunciation, but I got that goofed up. She was the Egyptian wife of Joseph, not Moses.
Oh, okay. So here's that language from Jacob 2:30. And I guess one other thing I wanted to point out is when we get to these arguments, these theological arguments that are really, really dependent on the punctuation of a scriptural verse, because there's an argument between Jacob Hansen and Jacob Isbell about that, about where exactly the comma should be placed or where the semicolon should be placed and how that pertains to interpretation of this verse. One of the things I want to point out, and I pulled the photo right from the Joseph Smith papers that's here on the slides, there was no punctuation in the original manuscript. And so when we have arguments that are really conditioned on, punctuation and where that punctuation is placed in a sentence, it's really difficult for me to take that seriously because we just didn't have any of that punctuation in the original manuscript.
By the way, it looks like that story about the Cushite comes from Josephus as opposed to the Old Testament. Just doing a little on-the-spot research.
I thought there was one like passing mention of it in the Old Testament, but I would have to go double check.
Okay, please do. And this whole thing about Jacob 2:30, just as another aside, it strikes me as unusual because in the entire 1,000-year epic of the entire Nephite Lamanite story, right? When would God need them to raise up seed more than in the very first generations of this people? And yet this is where it shows up, is in Jacob 2:30, and Jacob was actually born in the old world, according to the Book of Mormon, before they came here. So this is at the very beginning of their entire civilization. And they need people. So why wouldn't plural marriage be a good idea then? It seems like that would be the best time for it if they were ever going to practice it in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, it's built into the model, so it would make sense that it at least could have been practiced at any time during the Book of Mormon. Or how about when, there was such an outnumbering of the Nephites near the end of the book by the Lamanites? You could have seen something like that at that point as well. There's multiple different points in the story where it would make sense, but it's not present.
Yes.
So now let's turn next slide to Jacob's strongest and weakest arguments. I think he presents in this next clip.
As you listen to my opponent, just think how many people would have to have been involved and kept quiet their entire lives for this theory to be correct. Now, I don't mean conspiracy in a derogatory way. I mean it literally. Like, the only way for his story to work is if an incredibly large group, like 70 plus people in Joseph's inner circle, were lying and intentionally working together for years on a plot to kill Joseph Smith and take over the church. I mean, he thinks John Taylor killed Joseph Smith. The same John Taylor who said Joseph Smith did more for the salvation of mankind than any other person except for Jesus. Now, one last thing to consider. If the keys of the kingdom were given to Joseph Smith, but were not passed on to Brigham Young, who holds them today? If my opponent is correct, he either must posit that someone else holds those keys of the kingdom and the sealing power, or he must admit that Joseph Smith failed and we have slipped back into an apostasy. But didn't Joseph say that the keys of the kingdom would not again be taken from the earth? That this was the final dispensation? You see, the big problem is that if my opponent is correct, then what he proves is that Joseph Smith was not a prophet. But luckily, my opponent is demonstrably wrong. The historical record is quite clear that Joseph Smith introduced plural marriage, and the keys are still on earth today to bind families together forever. Thank you.
I'm surprised that he doesn't use deniable plausibility. I mean, now he's using demonstrably, which is the word I use all the time. So,
well, he should. And I liked his little argument there at the end about how all he succeeded in proving is that Joseph Smith was not a true prophet. He's a false prophet because he said that the keys would never be taken and there would never be another dispensation. This is the last dispensation. And then I thought he was going to segue into saying, fortunately, I can prove that Joseph Smith was a false prophet in a completely different way, because look at all the polygamy stuff he did.
Yeah, I think again, it's so funny to see him immediately pivot from basically calling the the polygamy deniers conspiracy theorists, and then immediately pivot to this like testimony mode, and even gets like the dramatic pause and the picture of the temple. It's just so obvious when you see it. Like, it's so easy to conjure those experiences. Like, we can all feel that uplifting rise for a second. It's not the spirit whispering to you. Like, these are very normal human experiences that people have when people know how to speak well. And I will say, to Jacob's credit, he knows how to speak well. He is a very good debater. He's very skilled at what he does. Again, just highlighting the special pleading that goes on here, where he immediately pivots from credentialed historians to, now it's time for my testimony. And so that just pauses, gives me pause and makes me ask the question, like, well, how many credentialed biblical historians take the view, again, outside of Mormonism, take the view that the sealing power is even a thing, that it's even a thing in the Old Testament? Or Dan Vogel's been talking in the comments about the Melchizedek priesthood being handed down. Like, this is where people who are raised inside of the Mormon church, they really just are so, and I feel comfortable saying this because I was a research assistant for Professor Wayman, and that's one of the things he opened my mind about, is about normal biblical scholarship and how Latter-day Saints really have been put behind by the church's like monomyth that these things have always been the same way, that Adam and Eve were sealed in the Garden of Eden. Like, these things evolved over time. And if people can't come to terms with that, I don't know what to say. They're not living in reality. And so if they're not, then they should stop talking about what credentialed historians talk about. If you want to use your testimony, use your testimony. If you want to use what credentialed historians talk about, then use what credentialed historians talk about. You can't pick and choose the evidence that comes out of one worldview just because it suits your argument against polygamy deniers.
It's sort of like using a tight and loose translation, whichever one is needed, isn't it? It's sort of, you bounce around to claiming, hey, no, wait a minute. We've got scripture. We've got revelation. Oh, wait, let's trust the historians. Let's not allow any sort of argument based on evidence that wouldn't really hold up in a courtroom, right?
Yeah, it's absolutely hilarious. And that's such a great example, Bill. But what it really just highlights, right, is look what Jacob goes to when he has to correct people who are claiming revelation that you can't just trumpet. What does he go to? History, facts, evidence, right? And sometimes he goes to revelation, but he's going to history, facts, evidence. So follow those things to their logical conclusion. How many credentialed historians believe in the magic or the ghost in the machine? They don't. And so if you're going to borrow from that worldview, follow it through. Like, follow it through or don't use it. You can't use those tools if you're not going to follow it through.
Yeah, I'm thinking that maybe just in future debates, that maybe Jacob Hansen should try drinking the decaf before the debate starts, because I've been watching him do what looks like the jitterbug, the sitting jitterbug. He seems quite nervous, and I'm wondering if there's just too much caffeine flowing through his system. It might be one of those Monster energy drinks or something that the young kids drink nowadays.
I had one of those earlier. So I don't want to we'll have a few different comments from Jacob Isbell. Let's move to our next slide, and that is a clip from Jacob Isbell.
Compare that publication with the teachings of First Presidency Heber C. Kimball, as he's now taking Brigham's side to make sure that he promotes what it's going to be like in the afterlife for the men who practice the doctrine of many wives and concubines. In the spirit world, there are an increase of males and females. There are millions of them. And if I am faithful all the time and continue all the time with Brother Brigham, we will go to Brother Joseph in the spirit world. Here we are, Brother Joseph. We are here ourselves, are we not? And with none of the property we possessed in our probationary state, not even the rings on our fingers. And he, Joseph, will say to us, come along, my boys. We will give you good suits of clothes. Where are your wives? They're back yonder. They would not follow us. Never mind, Joseph's going to say to us. He's preaching this from the pulpit to the Latter-day Saints. Never mind, says Joseph in his fictional spirit world fantasy. There are thousands of wives available for you here. Have all you want. Is this the God that Joseph Smith has ever once taught? This is why Jacob Hansen will not define polygamy. He makes up fake terms like celestial plural marriage, never used by Joseph Smith, to teach the doctrine of the God he serves, many wives and concubines.
Well, and this is, I said that this is the one area where I completely agree with the polygamy denier crowd. These comments about treating women like chattel, and even DNC 132 itself, with its repeated references to destroying Emma to destruction, they're disgusting. And the fact that people continue to justify this and make it okay is gross to me. My experience with DNC 132 is, when you're raised in the church, they're very careful about what verses in DNC 132 they'll allow. I don't want to say allow you to, but what they'll teach you in the correlated curriculum. It's always just the sealing power, the blessings of the sealing power. That's basically it, right? In fact, there were manuals that would specifically say not to read like the other verses,
like
if I remember
26.
correctly.
Yeah,
exactly. And the first time I sat and read DNC 132, like without anyone guiding me, was on my mission. And I remember reading it and having almost like a mini, I don't want to say a mini faith crisis because I was still a missionary and I finished my mission, but reading it, I just remember thinking the same thing Jacob Isabel's saying here. Like, I could not square the language of DNC 132 and the way it taught about how to view women with the worldview that I grew up in, which was very egalitarian, very equal. In fact, my mom, she's probably listening, my mom wears the pants in the family. I think all of us joke and know.
Well, I hope your dad isn't listening.
Well, probably not. Maybe she's letting him listen. I don't know. But yeah, it's just, this is the part where I completely do agree with the polygamy denier crowd, that I don't believe any God that would authorize DNC 132 is worth worshiping. That's really how I feel. I think it's gross. I think it's disgusting. I have 2 daughters. I don't understand why people are satisfied with allowing God to treat his children the way that we would never treat our children. I would never treat my daughters less than my son, period. And the fact that people make excuses for supposedly the perfect omniscient creator of the universe to do so is gross to me. And this is the one thing I think I could throw the polygamy denier crowd that I completely agree.
Yeah, very good. Bill?
Yeah, I was just thinking about when I did the long, whatever it was, 7 parts or something with Jim Bennett. And I asked Jim if he would let. Bennett? What's that?
You mean John Bennett?
No, not John C. Jim.
It's
Jim
an inside
Bennett.
joke because every time that Jacob Hansen says John Bennett, he goofs it up and he says Jim Bennett first, and then he corrects himself.
So Lyman Wright and John Bennett. Okay.
Yes.
So
Jim
when
Bennett.
I did the long conversation with Jim Bennett, there's a moment where I asked Jim if he would let his daughters stay at the Smith home, and Jim says no. And it's to what you're hitting on, which is any credible person who has any sense of morality has to get really uncomfortable with the things that are said in Mormonism about women, that are said that happen with young girls, that happen with other men's wives, and all of the apologists that don't want to go there sort of skirt around the issue and figure out some way to sort of dismiss it and not have to deal with it directly. It's the Patrick Masons, it's the Jim Bennetts of the world who, even if they're trying to present a faithful view, will look you in the eye and go, no, like I'm not okay with this stuff. This doesn't look good. Right. And that's how you can tell the folks that are really dealing with it head on. It makes them really uncomfortable, and they're not able to simply dismiss it out of hand.
Good point.
Completely agree. So our next clip is Jacob addressing some pushback from Jacob Isbell after they have a cross-examination period. And this is where I think Jacob really gets off the rails, where we'll follow through and explain kind of the logical consequences of his defense of polygamy here in just a moment. So let's play this one.
He didn't want to say this, but we can't undo the past. That is exactly what my opponent is doing tonight. He's just ignoring the historical record and saying, I can't believe that this would ever happen. And I'm not here to say that it always happened perfectly. I'm not going to say that everyone always did it right. There's a reason no credentialed historians are on his side, and why even the RLDS historians in the late 20th century, starting in about the 1960s, they basically were like, we agree. The historical record is clear. Okay? And so, in the end, how much time do I have left? Does he have time for another one? Remember, there's a difference between condemnations of unauthorized polygamy and spiritual wife systems. See, Joseph had a predicament on his hands. He was trying to both introduce plural marriage while putting down these other unauthorized bastardizations of it. That's why you have the statements by him. And if we go through those real quick, he's bringing up the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. Yeah, the norm is monogamy. It's okay to say that the norm is monogamy. Okay, only certain individuals at times are called to this practice. The release side we already talked about. Anyway, Joseph Smith, I don't have time to go through all the statements, but Joseph Smith made very few statements on the subject, and he taught it confidentially. That's the thing. That's the reason that we don't have a ton of stuff by Joseph Smith. And people like Jacob Isbell just can't believe that he would ever do this confidentially. Do you realize that the saints would have been killed if they had come out just out front about this? There were lives at stake. Is it okay if Nazis are coming knocking at your door asking are there Jews in there? Is it okay to maybe be a little deceptive, maybe avoid the question, right? So you have that going on, and then you also have them trying to put down these other bastardizations of what Joseph was trying to establish with the doctrine of plural marriage. And with that, I'll yield.
I think he likes saying bastardization a little too much for a good Mormon. But I mean, there's so many things that he's doing. You know, he talks very quickly. He talks about the 1835 revelation, by which I know he's talking about section 101, former section 101 in the Doctrine and Covenants, does not limit the practice of plural marriage, as he indicated it does. It denies that it's being practiced in the LDS church.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think, heaven forbid we should replay it. But he's talking about the 1835 revelation in terms of it limiting the practice of plural marriage.
Mm-hmm.
When it doesn't, it denies that it's happening at all.
Right. It also, and one of the things I think you've pointed out in the past, the way that leads in is because it uses language like, because this church has been accused of polygamy and fornication, or members of this church have been accused of polygamy and fornication. It's like, okay, well, right there, it's responding to accusations of polygamy. Mm-hmm. As early as that revelation was received. I think one of the things I wanted to highlight first, I think it's a very odd example to go right to Nazis, particularly when we're talking about Mormonism, because we do have the story of Helmut Hubner, which, may be worth an episode sometimes, guys. That's a very interesting story. Mm-hmm. But the other thing I was going
to say about Helmut Hubner, as I understand it, he was a young man in Nazi Germany who stood up against Hitler. He was a Mormon,
correct,
and for human rights for different people. And he didn't think that what was going on by the Nazis was cool, so he actually stood up against it. I think did he get excommunicated by his ward and ultimately executed or something? Correct. So he was a young man with the courage of his convictions who found no support or little support from his own church members, and obviously no support from the Nazi regime that he was challenging.
Correct. And believing members would say, well, we don't really know that he was excommunicated. We don't know explicitly that he was. And he was reinstated after he was executed. But yeah, the story of Helmut Hubner is that he was spreading basically anti-Nazi propaganda, and he wasn't comfortable with the Nazi regime. Because he had principles, I would say. Again, he's another person that makes me proud to claim some cultural heritage inside of Mormonism, because it did influence his life for the good. And I think did cause him to act so heroically. But yeah, he was executed because he was turned in by a coworker, if I remember correctly, and was excommunicated because I think would it have been Grant at the time that was the president of the church. They did not want members of the church ruffling Nazi feathers. They didn't want it to affect the church's missionary work, nor did they want it to affect, the opinion of the church in the eyes of that regime. And of course, believing members would then say, well, how do you expect them to know? How do you expect them to know what the Nazis would do? And it's like, because they claim to be prophets. You can't claim to be prophets and then act like you just have the insight and knowledge of normal people when it's convenient. And that's actually, aside from just the passing reference to Nazis that Jacob had there, I think one of the other things that I wanted to highlight is it's such an odd position that, earlier in this debate, Jacob is taking the Old Testament literally, taking a literal view of the Old Testament. And the Old Testament recounts just these miraculous stories repeatedly over and over and over. And yet he's saying that God couldn't have intervened. If God really wanted the saints to practice polygamy, why couldn't God have just protected them? Right? It's if you believe that Moses parted the Red Sea, if you believe that the city of Enoch was lifted up to the sky and protected by God, like I'm just highlighting, I guess, again, the special pleading that we see in this worldview. The Old Testament is literal when it suits his argument, but when it creates problems for his argument, or at least the God model that's offered by the Old Testament of repeated miraculous intervention, he won't follow that through. It's, well, what did you expect Joseph to do? They would have been hurt. They would have been killed. Well, then was God there or not? Did God authorize it or not? You have to pick a lane.
I want to push back against it just a touch, which is one is Samuel the Lamanite, which is a perfect example of God protecting somebody as arrows are being shot at them. Then you have the example of Abinadi, who God says, get out there, boy, do it anyway, attaboy, and he gets burned alive, right? But there's also the story, and I can't remember who it is, but it's like Amulek and someone else, and the women and the children are being burned, and one of them wants to stop it. The other one says, nope, this has to stand as a testimony. And so you do have these moments where there's the right thing to do, and God is telling the prophet, the prophetic mantle, the person with the prophetic mantle at that moment, not to intervene, not to do something. And so I'm only going to say that there are examples in scriptures of people chickening out from doing the right thing with a really weak demeanor and blaming it on God. But
no, that's a great point, and I appreciate that pushback, Bill. The only thing I'd say in response to that is, and you guys did a great episode a few weeks ago on, how apologetics make Mormonism indiscernible from a fraud. And I guess all I'd say is that argument basically is God works in mysterious ways, right? That's the justification, is we don't understand the will and mind of God. Well, guess what? A God that works in mysterious ways presents the same evidence in reality of random shit just happening. That's the reality, right? Then it's just, God picks the winners and losers. And how do you tell the winners from the losers? Based on what happened. Well, if that's what we're going with, then we could just eliminate, if we're using Occam's razor and we're thinking critically, we can just eliminate that unnecessary conjecture and the second layer of reality that no one can demonstrate to actually exist.
Right. Yeah. Well, that Samuel the Lamanite story, little known fact that helps explain why it was that none of the arrows hit him, is that the Nephites were notoriously bad shots.
They were like stormtroopers.
Yeah, they're like John Voight in Deliverance.
Pew, pew, pew.
Yeah.
That was actually a great reference. Remember John Voight in Deliverance shooting the bow and the arrow?
Yeah.
And he'd just start, that was the Nephites. Samuel the Lamanite. They couldn't get a beat on him.
I always pictured in my mind, this may be funny little bird walk, but I always pictured that Samuel the Lamanite like disappeared from the wall. Like he jumped off the wall and just like wrapped his cape around himself like Batman and just disappeared and was never seen again. I taught a real fun lesson once about how, the early Christian tradition of having one dark-skinned and two light-skinned of the three wise men was because it was actually Samuel the Lamanite and Nephi and Lehi. That's maybe a fun story for another time. Let's go to our next clip, and I think we're almost through the clips from the debate.
Abraham, etc.
Where can you give us an example that we can read for ourselves in the scriptures of God commanding polygamy?
Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, which was read in the High Council meeting in August of 1842.
Great. And added to the scriptures 3 years after Brigham Young's dead. Is there anything outside of section 132 that supports your claim that God commands it? Or in other words, let me just clarify. What example outside of section 132 does God command?
Jacob, the house of Israel was literally a polygamous household.
Where can we read that? In other words, where can we read God's...
The Bible.
Where can we read God's specific command for Jacob to take on additional wives?
God, they were practicing it right there. It was God who was doing it. God even says in Samuel that he gave the wives. Why would God in the scriptures say that?
Chapter? Can you approximate it? Hey, hold on. This is my time. Can you just approximate a chapter where we can? Because what I'll do after this, I'm going to clip this section Where can we find God commanding Jacob?
Jacob, it's not in the scriptures directly, but you can see through the practice of it and a lack of God's,
but you believe it,
and a lack of God's condemnation of what he was doing. Why would God
hold on,
allow
this
his
is my time. Hey,
household-
I was respectful to you. Nathan, the prophet, where can we find God authorizing Nathan to give David any, or either one of these? Where can we find God directing Nathan to give a wife to David, or directly instructing David? Where can we find God's command to practice polygamy with Nathan or David?
In the actual actions that happened.
From where can we read God commanding it? And you don't, I know I'm not putting you on the spot where you have to give an exact chapter.
Not everything in the scriptures is laid out explicitly. You can see in the behaviors of the
so
things
it sounds like,
that people
okay,
are
hold on,
doing.
I get you. So it
Let me
sounds
just
like,
finish the answer.
okay.
You can see in what people are doing what God is okay with allowing his prophets to do.
Because it sounds like
genocide. I mean, if you take that argument, you can take that to its logical end and pick out every shitty behavior in the Old Testament, global flooding the earth and killing babies and women. You can every genocide, the rapist being allowed to marry their victims by paying the father a certain amount of money. Jacob Hansen, that's a ridiculous argument. And nobody's going to take that argument and run with it unless you're willing to justify every shitty behavior in the Old Testament.
You
I don't even
mentioned
know.
slavery, did you?
Slavery? Yeah.
I want to read Exodus 21. Okay. And those are exact examples that I wanted to highlight, Bill. Exodus 21, and I'll read the King James Version to not
the whole thing.
No, just the verses talking about slavery. So this is talking about slavery, specifically the slavery of Hebrew slaves being held by the Hebrews. Exodus 21. Now these are the judgments which thou shalt set before them. If thou buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th year he shall go out free for nothing. If he came in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he were married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master hath given him a wife, and she have borne him sons or daughters, then the wife and her children shall be the master's, and he shall go out by himself. And if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master and my wife and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him unto the judges. He shall also bring him to the door, or unto the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. If we want to go with the argument that whatever God allowed in the Old Testament is therefore commanded and permissible and morally permissible, you've got a whole lot of explaining to do. This is, again, one of those positions, and this is the one that really fires me up the most, because the Old Testament records some really disgusting things. And the more mature, the more spiritually mature, the morally mature view to take would be that, we don't know exactly how God works with people, and he was, I don't believe that either. I just believe that this is a book that's, history mixed with myth, mixed with propaganda. The Bible is such a complex book, but just to take this view that whatever is recorded as happening in the Old Testament is what God permitted and thus commanded, that is a huge problem. Think about the fact that Elisha, the prophet, because he was teased for having a bald head, sends 2 she-bears out of the woods to kill a group of children. That's a prophet recording as killing a group of children because they teased him about his bald head.
Well, they were probably teenagers. They had it coming. But seriously, but all these things you're talking about, whether it's slavery or genocide, these are not things that God just said, oh, you're doing that, I guess I'm okay with it. He commands these things. The
lead in to Exodus 21 is these are the laws. This is actually an explicit command. So Jacob's arguing for implicit commands. This is explicit. This is recorded right in the book of Exodus. God's saying these are the laws that will govern this society regarding slavery. The other thing I'd point out is right at the beginning of that exchange, it's hilarious that they're talking about the authenticity of 132 and whether 132 was written by Joseph Smith and whether it was inspired. And Jacob Isbell asked Jacob Hansen, what can you point to in the scriptures to validate 132? And he points exactly right back to DNC 132. Like, hello, that is a logical circle, Jacob. Why would you waste time? Why would you filibuster a timed debate, a timed exchange? You're supposed to know the rules. You're the one who drafted the rules.
He created them. He's moderating the whole thing.
Exactly.
He's telling him, no, this is my time.
it just shows the big problem here. And to your point, Bill, on the genocide, this next clip is actually from a recent debate between Alex O'Connor, who has a wonderful YouTube channel and I think is an amazing speaker on skepticism, and Dinesh D'Souza. This actually happened just earlier in June. And the debate topic was, is the Bible true? It's over on Pangburn. If people want to go watch the entire debate, I'd highly encourage them to do it. But this is Alex walking Dinesh through the genocide of the Amalekites in the Old Testament. And I just don't think that Mormons really have grappled with some of these stories in the Old Testament because, frankly, we don't really talk about it all that much. We hit the highlights, we hit the pattern of prophets. But let's see the way that Alex, just reading from the scriptures, highlights how disgusting the morality on offer is here, that Jacob is apparently saying is on
now
offer.
go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. I'm told sometimes that this is actually an exercise in hyperbole. God didn't mean everyone. It continues, do not spare them, put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. And if you think that this is hyperbole, consider what happens when Saul does conduct the destruction of the Amalekites as ordered, and decides to leave alive the king as well as some of the best of the livestock. He leaves them alive. For this small act of mercy, God responds by saying to the prophet Samuel, I regret that I have made Saul king because he's turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. So not even the animals can escape this genocide. So I'd like to ask Dinesh, I suppose, directly, which is it? Is this a morally corrupt series of events, or do I have to dispel with my moral intuition that genocide, including of innocent children, is a bad thing?
Let's talk about the moral sense, since you raised it, and we'll just talk about
I want to
briefly.
make sure we've got time for Q&A. But look, I can reread the text if you like. The Amalekites.
Well, let's not talk about the Amalekites, in part because here's the problem. For most Christians, the Old Testament is different than the New and is seen through the light of the New. So if you want to go to, Dennis Prager, who has written about this from a Jewish perspective, has written about the Deuteronomy, the Book of Kings, the Amalekites.
Sure, we can bring him out
what he considers
later,
to be the justifiable massacre of the Canaanites. I don't really want to go there because.
Well, I know why you don't want to go there.
Well, the reason I don't want to go there, the Old Testament is full of horrific massacres.
Yes, and
that is hold on.
Massacres which are ordained.
Massacres which appear to be ordained by Yahweh directly. Sure. Agreed. And
why are you saying Yahweh instead of God? Why are you trying to distance yourself from the God of the Old Testament?
Yeah, I think just to drive home your point, Bill, I mean, just listen to that and listen to this tap dancing that we see from Dinesh D'Souza there.
Mountain Meadows Massacre is sort of a similar thing on a small scale. Anytime human beings are willing to concede their, as he put it, moral intuition to a religious voice saying, God told me, and I speak for all of us, God told me that we need to kill those people. Almost assuredly, any moment in history where that's happened, the more rational explanation is that some power-hungry, egotistical maniac decided to pretend to speak for God or was mentally insane and thought they were speaking to God. And they gave direction to these people to do harm, and these people subjected their moral compass to that religious authority because they trust that religious authority as speaking for God. And that is the ill of all religion. The moment you have the power within yourself to think for yourself, you should no longer ever accept someone else's idea of what God wants you to do. Now, some people at lower stages of development aren't able to make good choices on their own. They need directions, and religion gives maybe as many good directions as it does bad. But the moment you can think for yourself, you are so far better off not listening to dogma coming from religious authorities who claim to speak for God.
Yeah, and what happened in the Mountain Meadows Massacre, just in a general sense, is that the Mormons, the converted Gentiles to the true gospel, were teaming up with the Lamanites in order to destroy the non-Mormon white people, the Gentiles, which is something that is actually predicted in the Book of Mormon. And the Book of Mormon says that's what's going to happen, and it's what's supposed to happen, and it should happen.
Yeah. I just point out we had a few more clips. I think we've made the point that Jacob's constantly engaged in special pleading. And I want to address his brother, who runs a channel called Latter-day Skeptic, is in the chat saying, you're not acknowledging that this is a debate between two believers. He's arguing a point against Jacob Isbell. And I'm like, that's my exact point, Forrest. My exact point is that your brother picks and chooses the evidence that he uses depending on who he's debating. He doesn't care about presenting a consistent and reliable worldview. It's all about striking at other people's worldview. And to Bill's comments about reclaiming your autonomy, that's one of the things that's really connected with me leaving the church, is reclaiming my autonomy, allowing my wife, my partner, to reclaim her autonomy. Our relationship is so much more real and authentic in a way that I never believed it even could be. And I guess while we wait for calls to queue up, I had one more quote from Hitchens, because one of the things that people are probably wondering is, like, if you don't like if you don't like Jacob Hansen, you don't like his views, why are you giving him more airtime? In part, I already hit on it. It's because I think he's a bully. It's because I don't like the way he represents the church that still means something to me culturally, even though I do believe it's demonstrably not true. And I don't want a bunch of fundamentalist, self-appointed orthodoxy police running around. But the bigger reason is because I want people to understand that Word Radio and Jacob Hansen especially sell this narrative that if you leave the church, your life is going to have no meaning. Your entire life is going to fall apart. They're wrong. They're wrong about that. And that's been my experience. And I wanted to play one last clip from Christopher Hitchens, again, who's been really critical to my deconstruction. I know he can be triggering for some people because he's very strong in his words against theism. But this is from one of Hitchens' last public speaking events right before he died of throat cancer in 2012. And he really hits on the same themes that Bill was hitting on.
Why don't you accept this wonderful offer? Why wouldn't you like to meet Shakespeare, for example? I mean, I don't know if you really think that when you die you can be corporeally reassembled and have conversations with authors from previous epochs. It's not necessary that you believe that in Christian theology, and I have to say it sounds like a complete fairy tale to me. The only reason I want to meet Shakespeare, or might even want to, is because I can meet him any time, because he is immortal in the works he's left behind. If you've read those, meeting the author would almost certainly be a disappointment. But when Socrates was sentenced to death for his philosophical investigations and for blasphemy, for challenging the gods of the city, and he accepted his death, he did say, well, if we are lucky, perhaps I'll be able to hold conversation with other great thinkers and philosophers and doubters too. In other words, that the discussion about what is good, what is beautiful, what is noble, what is pure and what is true could always go on. Why is that important? Why would I like to do that? Because that's the only conversation worth having. And whether it goes on or not after I die, I don't know. But I do know that it's the conversation I want to have while I'm still alive, which means that to me, the offer of certainty, the offer of complete security, the offer of an impermeable faith that can't give way, is an offer of something not worth having. I want to live my life taking the risk all the time that I don't know anything like enough yet, that I haven't understood enough, that I can't know enough, that I'm always hungrily operating on the margins of a potentially great harvest of future knowledge and wisdom. I wouldn't have it any other way. And I'd urge you to look at those of you who tell you, those people who tell you at your age that you're dead till you believe as they do. What a terrible thing to be telling to children. And that you can only live, and that you can only live by accepting an absolute authority. Don't think of that as a gift. Think of it as a poisoned chalice. Push it aside, however tempting it is. Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way. Thank you.
And I think just in closing, I mean, I love those words from Hitchens. And I think just in closing, the last reason that Ward Radio and Jacob Hansen's antics really bully me really bother me, is because they use fear of other people and they use fear of things to keep people in the church. They use fear of how your life will fall apart, how your marriage might fall apart. how you might descend into wokeism, God forbid. And they're just wrong. There's so much beauty that people can find outside. And there's so much beauty. And I want to acknowledge there's so much beauty that people can find inside too. And I would not tell people how to live their lives. That's not my position. But if we're going to have a conversation about whether these things are actually true, because that's what I care about, then we need to actually follow the evidence. We need to be critical thinkers. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to do this response.
Well, thank you so much. You've done a great job. And Kolby came up with the idea for this episode. He shopped it to us. We said, absolutely. And so he's put in the laboring oar on all of this. I did want to say something, Kolby, about that last clip that you played between the two Jacobs, Hansen and Isbell, where they're talking about the Jacob of old and being married. And where does it say in the Old Testament that God ever commanded plural marriage? That entire clip. And all I want to say to both of them at the end of the clip is, what does this have to do with whether Joseph Smith practiced plural marriage? Because I don't think it has anything to do with it. I think they've slipped seamlessly from a historical discussion full on into a religious debate.
Right. And then I guess while we wait for callers, I guess the one last thing I just wanted to let people know is my wife and I will be presenting at Sunstone this year. We're not experts in parenting at all, but we're gonna share some anecdotes about, perspectives in post-orthodoxy parenting, some anecdotes, some conversations that we've had with our kids about leaving the church, about the way our life has changed, the way our beliefs have changed, and the good and bad experiences of that. And it's going to be completely friendly to believers, as long as those believers are not of the literal bully Jacob Hansen type, I guess is what I'd say. So that's the thing. If people are at Sunstone, please come check it out, or come please say hi. I love meeting ex-Mormon people, post-Mormon people, and people who are nuanced. It's a wonderful community.
Well, maybe Jacob will be there and he can publicly challenge you to a cage match.
Sure. I won't fight him because I'm not 12, but I'm happy to have a further discussion because, like I said, I want to strike back against his ideas. I want to strike back against some of the things I've seen him do that I don't agree with and I think are inappropriate. Like I said, the attacks against people personally. But, he's still a person, and I'm sure we can have a great conversation. Not really a debater, but I'm happy to have a discussion with him about any of these points. And again, if I strawmanned or stated his position incorrectly, he can feel free to reach out to me and correct me. I'm not hard to find.
And I think what Bill is saying is that he really loves how you put everything so well, Kolby, in your presentation, and he hopes you'll come back again sometime soon.
I heard him say I was really handsome too.
I did. I said both those things. And then the third thing I said is we do have some callers in the queue. So if you guys are ready.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right. Here's the first one. And I'm actually going to suspend new calls. We've got 3 calls to take. First one here is Ted. Ted, how are you? Oh, let me see if, no, you should be there. Ted, are you there?
Theodore?
I'm looking at my stuff and everything on my end looks like it's right. I'm going to put him back on.
Alvin?
I'll return him to the queue. Let's try Alyssa. Alyssa, are you there? I can hear you, but I can't hear you on the roadcaster. So give me just a second.
Hang in there, Alyssa. Bill's coming.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think I've got a technical problem. All right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put Ted back on, and we'll just have to put it on speakerphone. They will not be able to hear you guys, so they'll get their thought out, and then I'll hang up with them, and you guys can address it. So
back to the old days.
Yeah, back to the old days. Ted, go ahead. Hello? Well, Ted's not there at all. So now this is a fail here. So let me put him back. Let's try this again. Ted, are you there?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. Go ahead. Yep, go ahead, my friend.
Okay. So yeah, I had to call in. Like, this is a great episode, and I can't wait to see you guys' new show. And I just gotta say to RFM, he needs to check out like the Dark Knight Returns. That's gotta be his first shirt because Dark Knight Returns, Bruce Wayne is older and he's flying in like with the foot in the background. That would be a great start to the show. But anyway.
Thank you, Ted. Ted, I was really glad when the Dark Knight left
He won't.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just very sad that he returned it all. So that I didn't like the movie. By the way, no, this is not The Dark Knight, baby.
Okay, yeah. RFM is wearing his.
Okay, so identify it. Identify it.
It's a
Bill.
Wolverine shirt, Ted. But go ahead.
Yeah, there you go.
Go ahead with your comment.
That's what I think of your DC.
Yeah, he can't hear you.
I know.
Go ahead with your comment to Kolby.
When Kolby, you know, when he mentioned Jacob Hansen being a bully, I never really thought of him as a bully. He's such a tiny little person, but he's right. You know, like I always think of Pulp Fiction when Uma Thurman asked John Travolta if he was a listener or a wait to talker. And Jacob Hansen is certainly a way to talk, and he talks over. So, anyways, that was an eye opener for me. But, anyways, that's all I had to say, guys.
Thank you, Ted.
Great show, and I can't wait to see the next one.
All right, have a great day, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. When it comes to little guys being big bullies, there's a long historical bunch of precedents for that, including of Mice and Men. You remember Shorty picking on Lenny? Yeah, it happens.
All right, let's try to get the next one in here. Elsa.
It's called Little Man Syndrome.
Elsa, are you there? Alyssa, I'm sorry.
This is Elisa.
Elisa, go ahead. Go ahead.
So I kind of wanted to go back to, you guys touched for about 60 seconds on the fact that this whole discussion of was it Brigham, was it Joseph, it's a big distraction. It's a Mott and Bailey to, protect the institution of polygamy. They're so busy arguing over, who put in this horrible system that it takes away from the debate and the fact that it was a horrible system. None of these men who are discussing this are talking about the reality of what women lived in polygamy. They did not have the amount of autonomy that men had within that system. The church has never disavowed polygamy. They stopped practicing it. You can't have two living wives at the same time. Well, unless you civilly divorced one. But polygamy is still alive and well in the church. And it's continually ignored. Section 132 is still canonized scripture. And women, just have to deal with that. We were going to, it was all about protecting widows and orphan children. No, it wasn't. It was none of that. And no one in the church wants to talk about that. So, I'm grateful that we're discussing the problems of, polygamy happened, but doesn't really matter who instituted it. It was a horrible, immoral system that exploited women. The lives of these plural wives were horrible.
Right.
Read In Sacred Loneliness. Go listen to a Year of Polygamy with Lindsay Hampton Park. These women suffered under this system. Women today have their concerns about polygamy laughed off by the first counselor in the first presidency of the church. And all of this, who did what and when, is a distraction.
Yeah, Alyssa, I would say that all polygamy across the entire world, wherever there is religious coercion and manipulation and religious theology behind it, is always going to be an unhealthy, abusive, trauma-causing system.
Can I address Alyssa's comment for 1 second?
Hey.
I started watching the Remedy show on Scientology and, looking at other things on cult. And I saw the pattern of how many of these cult leaders instituted polygamy.
Yeah, right. They all do. And Alyssa, Kolby's going to respond here. I'm going to hang up with you. Kolby's going to respond. RFM might have a thing to say, but thank you for the phone call and very much appreciate your view and agree with it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess the one part I wanted to highlight about what she said, she said polygamy is still alive and well in the church, and she obviously pointed to DNC 132 still being canonized scripture. And I'd say even more than that, and we obviously have eternal polygamy with the current prophet and the current first counselor. But more than that, and this is one of the things that we really hit on when we looked at the Old Testament, is the premise behind polygamy is that men and women aren't equal. That's just a fact. And that women are like trophies or like knickknacks that you collect. I mean, that's one of the things about reading 132 completely on my own that just grossed me out as a missionary, is that it talks about women, and the story of Job in the Bible is the same way, that he loses his family, but then he receives more family. And so it's totally okay. God makes it okay by giving him more family. I'm sorry, but any of you who are parents, there's no amount of making up for if one of my children were lost to me. And the last thing I wanted to say to her comments is one of the hardest things about my deconstruction from leaving the church was actually recognizing in my relationship with my wife and in the way that I've treated people that we can do a lot of harm to people without ever intending to. And that we can have this implicit patriarchy that we don't even recognize, this gilded cage patriarchy that we treat people through. And so beyond just the fact that Alyssa's right, that polygamy is alive and well in the church, that patriarchy, that premise behind polygamy is, I think, the most important part that's still alive and well in the church. That, like she said, the Dallin Oaks can get up there and laugh off women's concerns, that people like Jacob Hansen think they can go pick on wonderful people like Dr. Julie Hanks. This is the premise that I agree with her. It's still alive and well, and it is so disgusting to me. And even though I don't think I ever treated anyone with explicit patriarchy, I definitely treated my wife with implicit patriarchy. And it was one of the hardest nights for me, was reconciling the fact that I could do that to someone I loved so much, and that I can cause that harm without intending to. So people who are grappling with deconstruction, it's okay to acknowledge your shadow side. It's okay to acknowledge that you can do damage to other people without intending to. What makes us a better person is the true version, in my view, of what repentance is recognizing our faults and attempting to change and become better than we were yesterday, today. That's what we can do.
Love it. All right, I'll go to the last phone call here. It looks like maybe it's Cheryl. So let's see. Cheryl, are you there?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes, I'm here.
you're on Mormonism Live.
First of all, you guys are amazing. I just have to say that. And this episode in particular was really kind of fun for me to listen to, because about 4 months prior to me sending in my resignation letter from the church, I had a 2.5-hour meeting with my stake president at the time. And why this was such a great episode for me was because so many of the things that you brought up were things that I brought to his attention, in particular with the polygamy and the fact that, as Alyssa had said, the previous caller, she has said wonderful things, and I agreed with her. It was a horrible thing, for one. Women and young girls were treated as cattle, basically, and property to be given. And as I was speaking to my stake president, I said, first of all, I don't know that if I ever knew that Joseph was a polygamist or not. I don't remember as a child growing up in the church. But I said, whether what I was told was the same thing that she was. Well, if a woman lost her husband, another man would take on her and her children. It was just for those purposes. And as of now, in the last couple of years that I'm learning all the real truth, that clearly was not the case. And I said to him, my stake president, regarding the scriptures contradicting each other, I said, I don't believe, first of all, I don't believe for 1 second that God ever commanded any man in the scriptures or otherwise to take more than one wife. And he said, well, what about Abraham? And I'll be honest, I'm not the greatest scriptorian. I sat there for a second. I thought, well, wait. You mean Abraham, Sarai, Hagar? I said, yeah. No, I don't believe that. I said, Sarai felt bad that she couldn't give Abraham a son or child. And so she it was Sariah's idea to say, here, take Hagar. I said, it was not commanded. And then I went home, looked it up, and pat myself on the back and said, okay, you're okay. Because I was right. I was right. But I also brought up to him that Jacob chapter 2 and then Doctrine and Covenants section 132. I looked at him, I put my hands up, and I said, which is it? I said, right here in Jacob chapter 2, it says, David and Solomon had many wives and concubines, which thing was abominable before me. But over here in DNC 132, it says, they so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so had many wives, in which thing they did not sin. I gave them through my servant Nathan. And I just looked at him, and he looked at me. He didn't know what to say. I mean, he just didn't know what to say. I said, well, which is it? Because you can't have it both ways. And it was liberating, this conversation. It was a 2.5-hour meeting. I had sweat from my armpits to my knees by the time I left there. But all of the things that you all are talking about were points that I had made to him. And I looked at him and I said, I'm going to tell you right now, if I was sitting in the chapel and one of the brethren from the ward came up to me and said, Sister Taylor, if I had a 14-year-old daughter, which I don't, but if I did, and he said, we believe that your daughter, it's been told to us that your daughter here needs to be married to this man over here that's 37, and she's going to be a third wife. I'd be like, I don't care who told you. It's not happening. I have to say, with Kolby, I really love the things that you said, and you said you didn't believe in revelation, and I agree with you to a certain degree. I believe in personal revelation. Like, I still believe we can have answers to our own prayers, but I don't believe that we get to have prayers for other people and receive their revelation, just like as is in the church right now. Very much so. You follow one man or a group of men, and they are receiving your revelation. That's not the way. Nobody gets to tell me what my personal revelation is. It's my personal revelation. But I had a question for Kolby. When talking about this whole conundrum, whether did Joseph really practice polygamy, I watched RFM and Bill Reel do that whole episode, and I loved it. It's been a number of months ago, about proving that the affidavits from William and Jane Law and Austin Cowles, the affidavits that were in the Nauvoo Expositor, the verbiage in their affidavits was, to me, very evident that they had received some sort of document that was very close to a rough draft or the original, whatever draft of Section 132. But Kolby had mentioned that there was something that Jacob had brought up that indicated that perhaps there was evidence that maybe Joseph didn't practice polygamy. So I was kind of just wondering which camp you're lying more in. Does that make sense? Like, for me, I think it would take 1 million people to orchestrate such a conspiracy that Joseph really didn't. And because there's that group of Michelle Stone and all those people that say, oh, Brigham Young and all of his cohorts hijacked the church and rewrote history. And those journals from Helen Mar Kimball and all those women were written so much later in life. And I've put it out there in these groups and said, well, they weren't even allowed to talk about it, much less write about it. So why are we not letting what they get to finally write about it? Why does it not get to be legit? But it kind of caught my ear when Kolby said that there was some form of evidence that perhaps maybe Joseph really didn't write Section 132 and or that he didn't practice polygamy. I'm kind of up in the air, but it seems to me to take a lot of orchestration, and without the communication with the internet and all those things that we have now, that would be really hard to do. But I want to know Kolby's thought on that.
Okay, thank you for the call. I'll let him respond. I'm going to hang up with you. Thank you for the call, caller.
Thank you.
Yeah. So maybe I didn't as carefully explain my position on that. I absolutely believe that polygamy originated with Joseph Smith. And it's not just because I believe Jacob's right about that he did author 132. And I think actually the evidence that RFM and Bill put together regarding the affidavits from the Nauvoo Expositor seal the deal on that. I don't see any other way to explain that because there are very specific details. My point was that Jacob pointed to Franklin D. Richard's journal to say that Franklin D. Richard Franklin D. Richards is talking about a revelation that was read at the Nauvoo High Council meeting on August, I think it's 12th, 1843. And that this proves that that was DNC 132 that was read at that August 12th, 1843 meeting. My point is that if you actually look at what Franklin D. Richards' journal talks about, and I think Jacob even acknowledges this in the middle, like implicitly acknowledges this in the middle of reading that quote, he changes the way that it's worded to make it vaguer so that it fits into this general bucket of polygamy. And I do think that's entirely possible. But my point is, when Jacob then pivots to his evidence about the Nauvoo Expositor and DNC 132 that I think he probably just borrowed from RFM, he's talking about correlation. And if you're going to use the correlation between the two documents to say this is absolutely what was read, it doesn't match. It doesn't match because the Franklin D. Richards journal is talking about Levirate marriage, and there's no reference to Levirate marriage at all in DNC 132. That was my point. One thing I wanted to address that she talked about, can we share the slides one more time, Bill? I changed it to the right page. She talked briefly at the beginning about Hagar, and I want to go back to this, and it really highlights, back to where we were actually on Hagar.
Right.
Okay.
The last caller, I think that was Cheryl.
Right, Cheryl. That's right. Thank you. So I want to read right from Genesis 16, and maybe this will combine with, women being less than and being property and the model of the premise behind polygamy. Because she asked about Hagar, and Hagar absolutely, Sarai was the one that brought it up. God didn't command it. That's not recorded in Genesis. To say that is just to not deal with what's actually there. But let's look at what it says one more time. Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid, that I may obtain children by her. Think about what that's saying. Ishmael, who's the child that comes out of that union, isn't even Hagar's child in this world, in this worldview, because this is an entirely different world. To go back to that quote, which I believe, Bill brought up, the past is a different reality. They do things differently. Like, it's a foreign country. They do things differently there. And to not acknowledge that, to not acknowledge that Hagar was a slave that was essentially, I wanted to say maybe a more over the line term, but she was essentially
broodmare.
Yes, that's exactly what she was. And she wouldn't even have a lineage linked to this child. Think about that. Deal with that. She's exactly right. She's highlighting the fact that not only did God not command it, but look at the premise behind this. Hagar isn't even her own. She doesn't even have her own personhood. She belongs to Sarai, who belongs to Abram, right? You can see the premise behind all of this, and it's just disgusting. The fact that people can justify this, aside from just explaining these people were desert goat herders that were illiterate, that this is pseudo history and part myth, part propaganda. That's how we reconcile this. If people want to maintain faith, not to take this literal view that people take out of convenience when it's, when they're in a debate with a polygamy denier.
Very good. Very good. I will tell you that what Alyssa said before that, where she was quite articulate and passionate about her dislike is too small a word, I know. Her finding that polygamy is an abomination to her personally. I don't know how God feels about it, but it's definitely to her. It is to me. It is to you, Bill. It is to you, Kolby, right? And yet, it is exactly this feeling that is getting more and more widespread, and more Mormons are finding themselves able to articulate it and to say it for themselves out loud, that I think is contributing to this groundswell of people who are on the anti-polygamy side, on the Jacob Isbell side. Because if they don't leave the church, now there's this middle ground where you can keep your testimony of Joseph Smith, and you can keep your testimony of the Book of Mormon, and you can have the very natural reaction to polygamy as being like a horrible thing where women are treated awfully, and that's not from God.
Sorry.
Everybody's a critic. So anyway, but you can have your cake and you can eat it too in this new system. And as long as you can avoid the question of what that does to the keys in President Nelson's hands today, since Brigham Young totally goofed everything up, right? Everything went off the rails with Brigham Young. He wasn't a prophet. He wasn't Keyes. And I think Jacob Hansen was addressing that issue, which once again has nothing to do with whether Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, right? But it does say, if you're going to take this position and you're going to be logically consistent, then how do you take that position and still believe that President Nelson is God's prophet on the face of the earth with all the keys necessary to do all the great stuff that goes on in temples that's necessary for exaltation?
Yeah, and I think to just directly address this premise, not to again be kind of a dead horse, but this view that Jacob at least takes conveniently to argue in this debate that whatever God allowed in the Old Testament is what's permitted. The problem with that view is that's just such a different model than what is sold inside of Mormonism today, right? Which is like that the prophet can actually receive real revelation, that Joseph received real revelation for the Book of Mormon. Again, just highlighting these inconsistencies between this position. There's no way to really take that seriously, because you can't then, if you acknowledge that God will permit people to be so morally abhorrent and somehow make it okay in the end, then how do you take the words that come out at General Conference or some church directive that seriously? You just can't, right? And that's again where we get back to our model of a God that works in mysterious ways sure matches the reality we'd expect if there were no God, and shit just happens to us.
Well, very, very good. So there's the 3 phone calls. Bill, do you have any closing thoughts? Kolby, you're welcome to have any closing thoughts too. I thought maybe that's what you just did, but if you have anything to add to that, please do.
No, I don't have anything to say. I really appreciate it, Kolby. I think that anytime we sit down and show how people think in rational ways versus irrational, I think it helps people to sort of sort out their own thinking processes. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. And thanks for all you do. I'm a huge fan. I'm usually listening to it live when I teach in the evenings here and there. And so sometimes I have to catch the show the next morning on my way into work. But you guys do great work. And both of you have really helped in my deconstruction and reconstruction in different ways. And really appreciate all you do. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Kolby. Well, thank you everybody for watching tonight. I believe that next week we will have on the show another special guest, and I don't think I'm letting the cat out of the bag if I say it's Jonathan Streeter. Am I, Bill?
Yeah. No, Jonathan Streeter, and we will spend some time revisiting his fake race apology. He reached out to me and said, enough time has passed. He thinks that now would be a good time to sit down and for us to sort of take a look at that and give him a chance to sort of speak about that whole process and the aftermath. And I'm really excited for the conversation next week.
The story behind the story. Okay, well, this is going to be exciting. First time here on Mormonism Live. So please join us next week, next Wednesday at 6:20 p.m. Mountain Time for the next episode of Mormonism Live. Good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us.